I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was.
When Queen Camilla set her sights on Princess Charlotte, she didn't expect Princess Anne to stand in her way, let alone break in tears doing it. The ballroom at St. James's Palace had never felt heavier. Red velvet drapes, golden chandeliers, and carefully arranged portraits of past monarchs set the tone for what was meant to be a celebration of legacy and continuity. But Princess Anne, standing near the grand entrance, wasn't at ease. The event was being held in memory of Diana, Princess of Wales. At least that was what it was supposed to be. But Anne had begun to notice something strange. It was in the language, the program design, even the speeches being circulated to aides. Diana's name was barely mentioned. She didn't say anything at first. Anne had always been one of the most disciplined members of the royal family. She rarely spoke out of turn and never showed emotion in public. She preferred hard work to attention, and she believed in keeping royal matters private. But tonight, something was off. She had attended many charity galas over the years, yet none had felt like this. This one, despite the smiling faces and clinking glasses, felt like a rewriting of history, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Across the room stood Queen Camilla, dressed in deep navy and surrounded by trusted aides. She was holding a champagne flute, but barely sipping from it, her eyes scanning the room like someone watching a performance. The press had already begun referring to her as the monarchy's new anchor, especially with Charles stepping back more often due to health concerns. Anne had noticed how Camilla had become more visible since the king's cancer diagnosis. And while that wasn't surprising, the way she handled power always gave Anne pause. At the center of the room, Princess Charlotte stood with her mother's grace and her father's posture. She was wearing a pale blue dress and clutching a small note card, rehearsing the short tribute she had been asked to give. Charlotte was only 10, but she was sharp, confident, and already learning how to move through royal life. Her poise reminded Anne of a young Diana before everything changed. That resemblance stirred something in Anne. She had never been close to Diana, not really. But over the years, Anne had grown to respect her, especially the way she reached people without trying to act royal. Earlier that week, Anne had overheard something that still bothered her. During a walk in the palace garden, two aides had passed by discussing how Charlotte's speech was being shortened. Apparently, Camilla had suggested cutting certain references to Diana's landmine work. "It's more about looking forward than looking back," one aide had said. That line stayed in Anne's mind. Now, standing here, she could see it playing out. The event's visuals leaned heavily on Charles's work as king, Camilla's patronages, and the royal foundation. There were panels showing current projects, but nothing from Diana's campaigns in Angola, Bosnia, or her work with HIV patients. And Charlotte's tribute, as brief as it was, had been slotted right before Camilla's main speech. It didn't feel accidental. Anne made her way through the crowd, stopping briefly to exchange words with guests and fellow royals. She spotted Catherine, Princess of Wales, across the room speaking to a group of guests. She seemed aware of what was happening but kept her expression neutral. Catherine had become good at that over the years, but Anne noticed the way her eyes followed Charlotte closely. When Charlotte took the stage, the room grew still. The child's voice was soft but steady as she read. "My grandmother believed that even one voice could change the world. She said that if we all played our part, we could make a difference. I believe that too. That was all. Nothing more." No mention of where Diana had said it or why. The applause was polite, but something was missing. Then Camilla stepped up. Anne moved to the edge of the crowd, watching every movement. Camilla began her speech by thanking the guests for their continued support of the royal family and highlighting the success of current royal initiatives. She spoke of continuity, unity, and responsibility, but she never once said Diana's name. Anne looked at Charlotte, who had returned to her seat. The girl was staring down at her shoes, fidgeting slightly. Anne had seen that posture before in younger royals, pushed into the spotlight before they were ready, or worse, pushed into roles they didn't understand. That was the moment Anne felt something shift inside her. She stepped back into the hallway, needing air and space to think. Memories of herself at that age came rushing in. She had swallowed a lot over the years. But now, watching Charlotte being gently molded into something palatable for the public, she couldn't stay silent much longer. She returned to the ballroom just as Camilla was stepping down. A photographer captured the queen consort with Charlotte, their bodies turned toward each other in a pose meant to look affectionate. But Anne saw it for what it was, a performance, the same performance Diana had tried to escape. Anne didn't approach them right away. Instead, she walked over to the event coordinator, speaking in a low, steady tone. "There's something I'd like to say before the program ends," she said. The woman looked surprised. Anne rarely spoke publicly at events unless formally invited, but something in her face made the coordinator nod without hesitation. And as Anne waited for the moment, standing behind the curtain with her hands folded calmly, she heard her own heart beating faster than it had in years. The silence that followed was unlike anything the room had ever experienced. Princess Anne stepped out fully from behind the curtain. She wasn't scheduled to speak, everyone knew that, and yet no one moved to stop her. Something in her face commanded the room with more authority than the event itself. Charlotte turned, eyes wide, unsure what was happening. Camilla stiffened beside her, lips parting slightly as if about to intervene, but she couldn't. Not when Anne had already reached the podium. Anne didn't glance at anyone. She looked ahead, gathering herself. Her fingers held the edges of the podium as if steadying something deep inside. "I wasn't meant to speak today," she began, her voice calm, almost low. But watching someone so young and full of promise step into a role she didn't ask for, I couldn't just sit by. Anne had always been known as a woman of action, not sentiment. But something about Charlotte, this poised child wearing shoes too large for her feet, literally and figuratively, had touched something in her. When I was her age, everything was already planned for me. I didn't understand it then. You don't when you're young. You wear the dresses, wave at the crowds, smile when you're told. But there comes a moment when it all stops feeling like play, and you realize it's not your name people are clapping for. It's the title. Her voice didn't tremble, but her throat worked slightly as she swallowed. People were listening now because Princess Anne letting the mask slip was something rare. Charlotte's eyes were fixed on her. Camilla's grip on her glass tightened. "I remember one evening," Anne continued, "I had been paraded through a charity event, introduced to every stranger as if I were a prize. And when I came home, I asked my mother why she let it happen. She didn't answer straight away, but later that night she came into my room and said, 'You're not here to be comfortable. You're here to serve. Learn to know the difference.'" There was a hush. No one dared interrupt her now. Anne looked down at Charlotte, finally. But here's the thing. Service doesn't mean silence, and it certainly doesn't mean manipulation. It doesn't mean standing behind someone else's ambitions because you're too young to see the game. The word manipulation hung heavy. Camilla's expression remained neutral, but her eyes had sharpened. William, seated near the front, leaned forward slightly, lips pressed into a line. Anne continued, her voice still composed but firmer. "I have made peace with many things in my life. Duty, restraint, sacrifice. But what I cannot and will not make peace with is watching another child walk blindly into something she doesn't yet understand, especially when the person guiding her does." The air shifted. A few heads turned subtly toward Camilla. She didn't flinch, but her smile had faded. Anne took a step back from the podium, her final words clear and deliberate. "Charlotte deserves the freedom to choose her path, not to be placed into one shaped by someone else's need for legacy." There was silence again, but it was the kind that came after something honest had been spoken, something people weren't sure they were allowed to feel. Anne left the podium without waiting for applause. None came because no one knew if clapping was appropriate after something so raw. She walked past Camilla, William, and Charlotte without looking at anyone. It wasn't until she stepped into the hallway beyond the ballroom that her pace faltered. She leaned lightly against the wall, letting the moment catch up to her. She hadn't planned to speak, but something in Charlotte's face had called out to her. The way she'd smiled for Camilla's approval, the way she stood still like a soldier in heels that didn't fit. Anne had seen enough of those smiles in her youth. It was then, alone in the hallway, that something cracked. A single tear slid down Anne's cheek, and she quickly brushed it away. as if even now she wasn't allowed to be seen like this. She was crying because she had spent her life building walls, and for once, she'd let them down to protect someone else. Someone she knew wouldn't see the danger until it was too late. Inside the ballroom, there was a pause in the proceedings. Camilla approached the stage, regaining control, her tone warm and measured, but it didn't feel the same. The room had heard something different now. The following morning, Princess Anne stood by the window of her private quarters at Windsor. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the ceremony, not even to Charlotte, who had knocked on her door before breakfast. Anne simply couldn't bring herself to answer. She wasn't used to feeling exposed. All her life, she had been the steady one who didn't need to speak to be heard. But yesterday, in that room full of powerful people, something had shifted. For once, she had stepped out from behind the curtain and spoken as an aunt, a sister, and a woman who had seen enough. Most importantly, Charlotte had listened. Anne knew it wasn't just about the speech. It was the look in the young girl's eyes, that shake of the head as Camilla leaned in during the final applause. Charlotte had pulled away. That meant everything. Still, Anne didn't trust that it was over. She walked into the corridor. A footman gave a slight bow as she passed, but she barely noticed. Her mind was turning. She knew Camilla well enough to know that one emotional speech would not be enough to break her hold. Anne made her way down to the stables. She found some comfort in the familiar sounds, hooves on stone, and the quiet hum of grooms at work. As she stroked the neck of her mare, she allowed herself a few seconds of stillness. That was all she could afford. Later that day, during the family's lunch gathering in the smaller dining room, Anne took a seat further down the table from Charlotte. Camilla, of course, had claimed the chair directly next to the girl. Charles sat in his usual place, trying, as always, to keep the peace without stepping on toes. The meal was quiet. Anne watched carefully. Camilla was talking to Charlotte, low and calm, her voice too soft to hear. But the girl's posture was stiff. Her shoulders didn't relax once. Every now and then, she'd glance across the table, catching Anne's eye. Anne didn't need to speak, as her eyes said everything. After the meal, the family was invited to a private garden walk, planned media-free outing to promote a healthy royal lifestyle. Anne lingered behind, pretending to adjust her jacket. As the group strolled ahead, she slipped beside Charlotte. "Did you sleep well?" Anne asked casually. Charlotte nodded. Then after a pause added, "Thank you for yesterday." Anne gave a soft smile. "I meant what I said." "I know." Charlotte glanced ahead. Camilla was turning, clearly looking for her. She wasn't happy after. Anne narrowed her eyes. "Did she say something?" Not really." Charlotte's voice was quiet now. "She just changed her face. She does that thing where she looks at you like you've ruined something." Anne knew that look. She had seen it plenty of times herself. "Charlotte," Anne said gently, "you don't owe her anything you don't feel." The girl nodded again, slower this time. There was understanding in her eyes, but also a shadow of confusion. It wasn't easy, growing up in a family like this, and now she was being tugged between a woman who represented tradition and another who held the crown. Back inside, later that evening, Anne met Charles in the library. He had asked to see her privately. "Anne," he said, closing the door behind them, "about your little speech yesterday." She waited. "I'm not angry," he said, then paused. But Camilla wasn't pleased. "I gathered. You caught her off guard. And Charlotte, she's been distant all day." Anne stepped closer, her voice calm. "She's thinking, Charles. That's what we want her to do." "I just don't want conflict." Anne raised an eyebrow. "You have a wife who whispers in your granddaughter's ear more than she does her own mother. That is conflict." Charles looked down at his hands. He was tired. The years had worn him down more than he liked to admit. "I know you love her," Anne added, "but your silence has allowed things to grow in shadows." There was a long pause. Charles didn't respond. He simply nodded, then turned away. That night, Charlotte didn't return to her usual room. A knock at Anne's door startled the older woman. When she opened it, the girl stood there, holding a pillow. "I just don't want to be near her tonight," Charlotte whispered. Anne stepped aside and let her in. They sat on the bed for a while, neither saying much. Then Charlotte spoke, almost as if confessing. "She told me I'm too soft, that I need to choose early who I want to be loyal to. Anne felt her chest tighten. This wasn't about preferences or attention anymore. This was manipulation. She said that? Anne asked carefully. Charlotte nodded. And she said, Mummy doesn't understand the throne the way she does. Anne closed her eyes. It was worse than she thought, but she would not let this continue. She felt it was time to speak to Catherine, because this wasn't just about Charlotte anymore. It was about the future of the monarchy, the kind of women they were raising, and the kind of crown that would be passed on. And Camilla had gone too far. She sat up in the small side room where Charlotte had fallen asleep on a wide armchair. The girl's hair brushed gently back from her face. Anne had told the staff to let her be. Outside the thick windows, the wind had picked up, brushing through the trees and against the old glass panes. But Anne barely noticed it. Her thoughts were on what she'd seen and had nearly let happen. When Charlotte stirred, Anne spoke softly. "You all right? Poppet?" Charlotte sat up slowly, still in her pale blue dress from earlier. "I didn't mean to embarrass anyone," she mumbled. Anne looked her in the eye. "You didn't, and if anyone felt embarrassed, it's only because they forgot who they are." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a steadiness, like stone. She wasn't pointing fingers anymore, but she wasn't excusing anything either. Charlotte's gaze dropped. "Grandma Camilla said I needed to learn how to fit in better." Anne let out a breath, firm but kind. "Charlotte, you were born to lead, not to shrink. Don't ever forget that." The words landed. It wasn't the way most people spoke to children, but Anne had never believed in coddling where truth was needed. And Charlotte, more than anyone, needed the truth. Later that morning, Camilla made an appearance in the breakfast room. William and Kate had already left early with George and Louis. Charlotte hadn't wanted to go, not after everything. Anne sat at the end of the table, with Charlotte beside her. The air felt as if something had shifted. You could feel it in the way Camilla hesitated at the doorway before stepping in. She smiled. "Good morning," Anne answered without looking up. "Morning." Camilla moved to pour herself a cup of tea, but her movements were measured. She sensed the space had changed. Anne wasn't being subtle. After a long pause, Camilla said, "I suppose things got a little dramatic yesterday." Anne finally looked at her. "They did." Camilla raised her eyebrows slightly. "I was only trying to help her understand her place." "She knows her place," Anne said. "She just needed someone to remind her it's not beneath anyone else's." Camilla pressed her lips together. "It was never about that." Anne's voice stayed even. "I know what it was about." Charlotte sat still, listening and watching. It was one of those moments where no one shouted, but things were said that would echo for years. Anne pushed her chair back gently. "I won't stay long, but I'll speak with Charles today." Camilla's face twitched. "About what?" Anne didn't answer. She didn't need to. When she and Charlotte stepped out for a walk around the grounds, Anne was quiet for a while. But then she said something Charlotte never forgot. "There are two kinds of women in this family, the ones who smile when they're told to, and the ones who choose when to smile. Both are strong, but only one stays true to herself." Charlotte looked up. "Which one are you?" Anne gave a rare smile. "What do you think?" Charlotte smiled too, but deeper than that, she understood. Back in London, Anne kept her word. She went to Clarence's house and asked to speak to the king alone. Charles looked tired. His health hadn't been at its strongest, and he was still managing the pressures of reigning. But when he saw Anne walk in with that look, he knew this wasn't a social call. She didn't waste time. "She's 10, Anne said, "and she already feels like she's being shaped into someone else." Charles frowned. "You're talking about Charlotte?" Anne nodded. "And Camilla, you've got to talk to her. Tell her to step back." Charles sighed. "Camilla means well. I know," Anne said softly, "but that doesn't make it right." They talked for nearly an hour. Anne didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse or dramatize. She just explained how children absorb more than we know, how Charlotte needed confidence, and how the women who shape her now would define what kind of woman she becomes. Charles listened. For the first time in years, Anne saw in his eyes that he wasn't thinking of how to defend someone. He was thinking about what needed to change. By the end of their meeting, he promised he'd speak to Camilla. And more than that, he'd make sure Charlotte had more time with her mother, her grandmother Carol, and with Anne too. Back at Kensington Palace, Charlotte came home to find a small parcel on her bed. Inside was a silver pendant with a tiny horse carved into the back. It was Anne's, one she'd worn often in her younger years. She hadn't said anything about it. Charlotte held it to her chest, quietly, smiling. That weekend, Anne took her riding again. This time, Charlotte rode ahead, laughing, arms loose and confident. Anne stayed just behind her, watching. And for once, Princess Anne, who rarely cried, felt the beautiful weight of having saved someone in time stir in her chest. Did Princess Anne do the right thing by stepping in when no one else would? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.